Bombers, it might be said, have changed the face of warfare more than any single factor in the 20th century. Not long after the Wright brothers invented their successful airplane, they were demonstrating its capabilities to the Army. Soon, the airplane was dropping explosives farther behind enemy lines and more accurately than any artillery of the time. By the end of World War I, day and night bombing missions over hundreds of miles had become common. For the rest of the century, bombing techniques, the airplanes that delivered the bombs, and the bombs themselves have seen refinements no one could have imagined at the time the airplane first went to war. Dramatic increases in the loads the bombers could carry, their stability and the altitudes they could drop from, and the distances they could fly made modern bombers a terrifying threat to an enemy. And particularly when the first atomic weapons were unleashed, the world saw a new horror in the massive and immediate devastation that one airplane could bring about. Now, as the century ends, major air forces of the world fly aircraft that can deliver their explosive cargo at extremely high speeds or from miles above the battlefield, out of reach of anti-aircraft fire and a tough target for ground-based missiles. Bombers have two basic roles. Strategic bombing is intended to reduce the enemy's ability in a general sense to wage war, as well as to hinder their will to win. A strategic bombing attack may be against oil storage depots, lines of supply like rail yards, an airfield, or even an industrial city. But strategic bombing is not a precise science. It's a crude hammer against an enemy, and results are not always easily measured. Tactical bombing is intended to affect the outcome of a given battle. Usually, tactical bombing takes place close to a front line, and is usually against specific battlefield assets, such as a tank or invading troops or artillery or missile emplacements. Which are the best bombers of all time? A worldwide panel of experts assembled by the editors of Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine have reviewed bombers from World War I to today. This panel of 25 historians, combat flying veterans, commanders, test pilots, and aircraft designers has picked the best one from nominees for each of 6 eras. A CompuServe forum was opened for votes as well. At the end of this program, you'll find out which of the 6 bombers is selected as the best bomber ever. But first, how do the experts judge the capabilities of bombers? Just what criteria do they use to evaluate them? A bomber's impact on the war is first and foremost the obvious measure. The bomber needs to weather enemy threats and get to the targets, carry enough of the right weapons, deliver them successfully, and then get home again. But after all that, what are the results?
We have had a revolution in aerial warfare. There's no doubt about it. The stealth technology worked probably better than even I thought it would. When you think that those airplanes night after night after night went to the most heavily defended target in the world, probably in Baghdad, with all the thousands of guns and hundreds of SAMs, and came back without taking a scratch, that has to be a revolution.
Their ability to penetrate hostile airspace is critical. For instance, the F-111, with supersonic low-level flying ability, can get to a target before it's seen by radar or targeted by ground fire.
Particularly on night 1, we were flying at low altitude, high speed, doing a toss maneuver on an airfield. I felt really confident that we could avoid all the threats we needed to, particularly the air-to-air threats. I was not worried about for the most part. I didn't think any Iraqi pilots would be coming down and taking a look at us at low altitude as we were flying.
Range allows the bomber to travel far and reach deep to hit an enemy and still get back to base. Intercontinental bombers like the B-52 have set a new standard for long-distance missions. Aerial refueling, when it's available, can extend the range of bombers even further.
And we can strike anywhere, anytime, over a very long distance. Its ability to go very far forward and make a tremendous impact immediately is its greatest asset.
The bomb load available is an important criteria. Light strike bombers carry less than the long-range strategic bombers, but given the aircraft design and mission, when it comes to bombs, more is better.
B-17 was not exactly a heavy bomb load carrier compared to today's airplanes. You needed quite a few airplanes to deliver the tonnage that they wanted in any particular target. So that's why they're making up so many airplanes to hit a particular target. It would be one group after another to sort of saturate bomb the particular target you were assigned that day.
The accuracy of targeting, a result of the bomb delivery system, and the airplane's stability and control predictability makes a huge difference. Now some systems allow the pilots or weapons officers to adjust the bomb's course while it's falling with laser or TV guidance precision.
Because they are guided en route, you can be a little bit off when you release them and still hit the target, as opposed to an unguided bomb where you have to have your conditions exact when you release it or it'll miss. So it's a lot more forgiving, and that was one of the things that led to our over 92% hit rate.
Defensive capabilities. For early bombers and on through World War II, defense came in the form of machine guns. Now it's more likely flares to ward off missiles or stealth technology to make the airplane blind to radar, or speed, as it was with the quick HE-111.
Being faster than any fighter of the time, this meant that an opposing fighter couldn't catch up with it. So this made the pilots show they were overjoyed with it.
Survivability. Can the bomber withstand or evade attack by ground fire, or from fighters, or from surface-to-air missiles? And if hit, does it still have a chance of taking its pilots and crew home? One pilot talks about B-17s.
This airplane would sustain damage that would put other aircraft on the ground immediately. There's no doubt about it. Everyone understands that this was probably the safest bomber to be in an attack position from that there has ever been built, at least to my knowledge.
The first era of bombers, 1910 to 1925, saw the earliest efforts at using airplanes in war, with some bombing skirmishes even before World War I and at the outset of the war. Bombers were quickly developed by most major nations. Larger airplanes with more engines quickly evolved with one goal in mind: carry more bombs farther into enemy territory. The nominees for Best Bomber of this first era of flight are the de Havilland DH-4, built under license in the U.S. It was the only American-built bomber to fly in the First World War. The Gotha G4 and 5. With a 77-foot wingspan, it was among the larger bombers of the First World War. The Handley Page 0400. Britain's answer to the Gotha, it had a 100-foot span and could carry a 1,650-pound bomb. And the Zeppelin. These lighter-than-air dirigibles could hover over a target for long periods of time. And the winner, the Gotha bombers. They routinely carried 6 110-pound bombs on raids to Britain with a pilot and navigator aboard. There was, for daytime missions, a gunner as well. The Gotha 4 started its raids on Britain in May of 1917, and the immediate result was that British aviation had to be pulled back from the French front to defend the homeland. The G5, with a ceiling of 21,000 feet and range over 500 miles, shifted to nighttime raids in September of 1917 to counter the strong British daylight defense. Peter Gross is a leading World War I historian who specializes in German aviation.
So the real secret, what made the Gotha such an effective bomber, is that when the Germans began to implement strategic bombing in 1917, the Gotha was the only airplane, twin-engine airplane, that could carry, let's say, a respectable bomb load and at the same time have the range to drop bombs on London. This plane could carry out 7 or 8 hour missions, flying in or out, or over London and back. So that's what made the Gotha, that's why the Gotha was used.
Peter Kilduff is also an historian and expert on World War I.
The most successful Gotha raids came at night. They flew over usually on a dark night, dark moonless night. There would be 6 to a squadron, and you would have several squadrons collaborating on large raids, smaller groups on lesser raids. In one case, there were almost 20 aircraft on a raid, going again right into London.
On the 7th of July, 1917, 22 Gotha bombers reached London and devastated the area around St. Paul's Cathedral, including London's main post office. 57 civilians died and 193 were injured in that one raid.
So what the Gotha did strategically, it tied down a great amount of the British defensive forces in London and forced the withdrawal of some top-notch fighter squadrons to the British Isles, plus guns and manpower to defend London. And the Gotha has become, just by virtue of its prowess and what it did over England, let's say that and a Zeppelin, becomes sort of a generic term for the destructiveness of the World War I bomber. You talk about the Gothas, just like Snoopy talks about the Red Baron.
Peter Kilduff interviewed John Canauer, a Gotha pilot.
He said, with these tremendous big wings, he said, it was like you were out there soaring, and very, very responsive. He told me he thought it might be like trying to drive an elephant down a small street, but in fact, it was riding on an elephant on a pretty big street. The airplane was very responsive for a bomber. Said that in his estimation, the best of the night bombers was the Gotha.
During the period between 1926 and 1942, bombers sprang from small attack models or from airplanes originally conceived as passenger-carrying aircraft. Or bombers were developed by nations with secret plans. At Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. fleet in 1941 showed just how successfully refined its bombers had become. The nominees for Best Bomber during this era are the Junkers Ju-88, a high-speed bomber that took on the roles of attack, reconnaissance, and fighter as well. The Douglas SBD Dauntless. SBD became slow but deadly. This 1930s model bombed in the Pacific throughout World War II. Aichi D-3A Val. Designed in Japan in 1936, it was a key attacker during the raid on Pearl Harbor. The Nakajima B-5N Kate, also involved in the bombing of Pearl Harbor, this carrier-based model carried bombs or torpedoes. The Heinkel HE-111, developed by Germany as an airliner, it was secretly turned into a bomber and used in the Spanish Civil War. The Vickers Wellington. When World War II began, it was Britain's finest bomber, with the range to reach Germany. And the winner, the Heinkel HE-111. To some, the Heinkel 111 looks like a bullet with wings. It was one of the sleekest and fastest airplanes of its era. Developed first as a passenger-carrying airliner, it was then turned into a bomber. The sleek design made visibility for the pilot difficult at best. All the flying was done by a single pilot. Herb Weber flies one for the Confederate Air Force, an organization that preserves and flies wartime aircraft.
It's the only Heinkel in the world that's still flying. It's a former German bomber, and we take it out on tours, display it to the public for history purposes. The airplane operated with one pilot, and up front they had the bombardier and gunner in the nose. and they had 3 gunners in the back. It was a single pilot operation. It was a Blitz bomber. I believe they built 8,000 of them. And they come in at low level. They didn't have a bomb site per se, just sort of a makeshift bomb site. And what they did was just low level and drop their bombs on whatever they thought they could destroy. And the airplane carries 8 500-pound bombs. So that's a pretty good lot of explosives.
Bill Nagel helped restore this 111 for the Confederate Air Force.
A Blitz bomber, if you take the word Blitz, Blitz in German means lightning. So it means lightning attack bomber. And that's exactly what it was. It went in fast, surprise attacks, did its destruction, went on to the next target. And the idea was to use this aircraft, a fleet of these aircraft, to attack the Low Countries, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, France, as quick as possible. That was Hitler's aim. And until the Battle of Britain, when they came up against a superior fighter force, the airplane pretty much had its own way.
Herbert Knobel was one of the Luftwaffe bomber pilots. He flew 162 missions.
I had an assignment to go over to England, and I forgot the town now, and I was in the combat area. I had to stay as high as I could with the plane, and I had to light the target with parachute lights on it, and I had to stay over the area for quite a while. And naturally, after you are there, the searchlight gets you. And when the searchlight have you in a focal point, then the anti-aircraft have you. And then when it got a little bit too hairy, I just put the Heinkel 111 in a spin at nights from about 20,000 feet, and I got it out about 3,000 feet. And then we just made it home, and we came home and had a couple of anti-aircraft holes in the wing, but we made it safely home. That was one of the, and if you do something like this, you suddenly realize how familiar you are with the plane and how you, there was nothing that, you felt absolutely safe in the plane, let's put it this way.
Despite being shot down on a later mission and crash landing in the English Channel, Knobel's faith in his 111 is unbroken.
Whenever you ask me about the Heinkel 111, I would say there's no better plane everywhere. You know, but to tell you different particulars, I don't know. It's just the security you feel.
It wasn't a precision bomber. They used it to get in, dump a bunch of explosives, and get out, and do it in a hurry because the airplane was so fast. When the airplane was built, it was way ahead of its time as far as speed and design and everything. So that's why they had the advantage in the beginning.
The next era of wartime bombers, 1943 to 1946, incorporates those that became key to the outcome of the war. These bombers gained refinements to allow them to better defend themselves, to deliver greater loads more precisely, and to reach deep into enemy territory from bases safely on the other side of the lines. The nominees for Best Bomber of this era: the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. It evolved from a coastal defense aircraft to become the symbol of American resolve to win against all odds. The North American B-25 Mitchell, the ideal medium bomber and the mainstay of Doolittle's Tokyo Raiders. Consolidated B-24 Liberator. More of these were built, 18,000, than any other American aircraft, and it served in every wartime theater. Avro Lancaster, 4 Rolls-Royce engines, and a huge bomb bay made this British entry the only aircraft that could carry the 22,000-pound Grand Slam bomb. De Havilland Mosquito. It could cruise over enemy territory at 40,000 feet and 400 miles an hour. Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. This was the airplane tasked to burn Japan to the ground, and the first to strike with atomic bombs. And the winning bomber, the Boeing B-17. By the time the final version was introduced, the B-17G model in 1943, it could carry a devastating load of bombs and protected itself with 13 50-caliber machine guns. The B-17 was a bomber, but so effective defensively that its gunners claimed to have shot down more enemy fighters than did any other American aircraft of the war. Harold Weakley, a B-17 pilot, completed 19 missions and was downed on his 20th.
Of course, nobody liked to attack a B-17. A B-17 was a pretty good piece of iron, and they really didn't look forward to it, but they had to because they were trying to defend their country, as, of course, we were defending our philosophies.
Ultimately, the raids pushed to the heart of Germany itself and across Germany to its major eastern cities, Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden. Germany unleashed an increasingly massive concentration of fighters to defend the homeland.
My first mission was to Berlin. I would much have preferred to have a little shorter mission and maybe something in France. But it was a long mission, very difficult. Of course, you know that they would defend their capital as we would defend our capital. And we lost a lot of aircraft there, a lot of anti-aircraft, a lot of fighters, and it was really quite an indoctrination.
Paul Kelly flew 26 missions into the heart of Germany from 1943 to 1945.
U.S. Air Force mission for daylight bombing, yes, it fit the role very well because it could do exactly what they were planning to do with it, which is high altitude, so-called precision bombing, and supposedly being able to defend itself in daylight raids. The British thought we were crazy, but the U.S. persisted, and despite all the losses, in the end, they did what they set out to do.
Perhaps most amazing was how many B-17s survived, despite what they faced on each raid, to fly new missions again and again.
On occasion, I have been I would think, in the middle of a formation, and I could see airplanes ahead of me all the way into the target, and then on the way back out, I could see formations still going in. So we're talking of great numbers because each of those dots that you were looking at was a group of 54 airplanes. So it was quite a bomber stream, and I'm thankful that I was in the position I was instead of being on the ground.
Bill Service completed 20 missions and was shot down on his 21st.
Well, it's a very docile airplane, doesn't have bad habits, flying habits, very easy to fly. There's a nice big vertical fin and rudder, which makes it much easier to handle with an engine out. It was an extremely good airplane in terms of structural integrity with combat damage, but many 17s came back that looked like they should have never made it. So all in all, it was a great airplane.
It was a comfortable feeling, if you want to call it that, to be in that airplane. It sustained a lot of battle damage. So you felt fairly secure that the airplane was going to come back with you in it. There's the classic picture of a B-17 that came back that had been rammed by a 109. Almost cut the airplane in half back at the waist, and the 109 fell away and supposedly crashed, but that airplane flew back almost cut in half.
Well, I believe the fact that it was a good aircraft to fly, it had good altitude capability, very stable bombing platform, had good range, and take and absorb a lot of battle damage and still get home.
That it brought me home 19 times. It supported me on the 20th time long enough for me to get our entire crew out of the airplane, and that's all I ever asked for.
The fourth era of fighting planes is 1947 to 1960, when the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union put new requirements on bombers and spawned the civil defense generation, fearing the possibility of a surprise nuclear attack from another continent. The bombers nominated are the Boeing B-47 Stratojet. This swept-wing bomber could outpace the fastest fighters, but never dropped a bomb in combat. The Convair B-36 Peacemaker. Ordered early in World War II, it first flew in 1946 with maximum range over 8,000 miles and a crew of 15. The Tupolev Tu-95 Bear. Introduced in 1956, it was the backbone of the Soviet nuclear strike fleet. The winner, the Boeing B-47. 2,000 B-47s, each with 6 engines and weighing in at 200,000 pounds, were built by the time its production run ended in 1957, and it remained in service well into the 1960s. The principal mission of the B-47 was nuclear deterrence. The concept then was if the Soviet Union became a threat or launched missiles at the U.S., the B-47, equipped with nuclear bombs, could, on a moment's notice, fly over the polar regions and attack. A young Air Force lieutenant, Carl Wayne Wachsmuth, had been assigned to B-47s in 1959.
Most of that was what we called home alert or reflex alert, with the airplane actually sitting cocked at the end of a runway or in a parking area very nearly the runway, ready to take off. In the U.S. here, we used to figure we needed to be airborne in 15 minutes. Some of the overseas bases I was at, or in Spain, they used to say we need to be off the ground 8 minutes after the horn went off, because when the missile era started to creep in, then why the warning time went down to zip almost, and so we had to have very rapid response for that. But so it was a nuclear bomber, and probably would have done an excellent job if it had been ever called to do what it was designed for, because it was a maneuverable airplane. You could roll a B-47. Folks did it. I won't claim to have done it because it wasn't something you were supposed to do. It was a fast airplane. We flew. We could fly low level at 425 miles an hour, 425 knots, which is in excess of 500 miles an hour. It flew very well. It was a very responsive airplane. It had power controls, hydraulic power controls on all 3 axes, so that you didn't have to really horse it around.
The airplane, with its swept wings, pod-mounted engines, and bubble canopy, looked like a kind of cross between a jet fighter and an early commercial jet airliner.
3-man crew. You had an aircraft commander or pilot, co-pilot, and the navigator, who was also your radar bombardier, in the nose, and a rather black windowless compartment up there. But the 2 pilots sitting up in that bubble canopy, almost like a jet fighter, excellent view.
The closest the B-47 came to combat was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961. Missiles from the Soviet Union aimed at the U.S. mainland were found on Cuba, primed and ready to fire. President Kennedy imposed a naval blockade against the Soviets and put all U.S. forces on a wartime footing. B-47s were among the airplanes assigned to maintain a presence over the Soviet fleet in the Western Atlantic and put on alert throughout the rest of the U.S.
Everybody was pretty grim during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there's no denying that. We had a head start on it because SAC was already generating its entire force, putting this thing on alert and loading the airplanes before President Kennedy made his speech. So we were a little bit ahead of the game on that.
Requiring a full retaliatory response.
Ultimately, the Soviets backed down and agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba, and the crisis ended. The B-47 was the precursor to all jet transports, airliners, cargo aircraft, and large bombers that followed.
If you look at the B-47 and then look at every commercial airliner, every subsequent big bomber like the B-52 and so forth, the B-47 is granddaddy. The swept wing, streamlined fuselage, underslung engine pods were things that the designers at Boeing came up with. You look at everything we fly today that's a good-sized airplane, and it's the same lineage all the way through. We haven't really made any more leaps since that. This was the first of its era, and for the first crack out of the box was an outstanding airplane.